Now this is to, in sense, Isaca is a learning forum. So any questions you have come up with, please feel free to ask it. And also at the same time, Digit is there helping us, and we have a Twitter account. The hashtag is bigdata.lk and Isaca SLC. You can always follow us through that. And the questions that come through our Twitter account also I'll be asking here, so we get a better idea. Now, we are talking about big data. We have been listening to big data. In short, just to start things off, can people tell us exactly what big data is from the...
It's big.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, big data should have this criteria that from the volume perspective, from the velocity perspective, right? And I also mentioned from the value, right?
Right. You mentioned in a slide about NoSQL, what the database that is used and then translates to SQL afterwards. What is this NoSQL? Can you go?
Yeah, it's basically just a term that we use actually to perform to store the key store, right? And usually it is a very simplified way actually to put and get informations, right? For example, I put in David, and I put in the data about David is a block of my pictures, right? So if I would like to retrieve it in the future, I just get David, and those pictures will be written to me. Right.
Yeah. Now, why can't we store this in a SQL format initially? What is the...
Well, the idea is that it's a fast retrieval.
Okay. So the speed of the retrieval.
The speed, yeah.
Any questions on this from the audience? Does Oracle give this flavor of NoSQL in the database?
Yes.
Is it a standard thing we need to be purchased?
Well, it's part of our big data solution portfolio, right? It's not part of the standard Oracle database itself. Yeah. All the questions seems to be directed to me.
I think it was Parakum who mentioned about telcos know exactly what we do. Is there a legal thing in Sri Lanka about this? Can Mr. Sujit go?
Planet is the only earth where you pay to live. The earth is the only place you pay to live. So under the National Security Act, they can monitor everyone.
They can monitor.
In every country. So the national security supersedes everything else. So you still have a privacy law. You saw what we saw at the NSA in every country. Now, look at Singapore, for example. I was part of the initial setup when they did the Cyber Watch Center, 2002, 2003. So I worked for ECOP. They were primarily monitoring the perimeter of the country. But right now, they've gone one step further, where they start monitoring the traffic of sensitive information. So when you look at a critical infrastructure from a national security perspective, the government can overrule. Right? So that's debatable. So I think we should leave it there.
We got now this is for the entire panel. We got a question from our Twitter account. It's by Mr. Muzakir, Muzackir. He said, he asked us, how capable is the IT infrastructure in Sri Lanka to capitalize on big data? If it is advanced, which sector is most geared, telco or banks?
It's all to do with organization strategy. Right? So first and foremost, let's ask, are we secure first before we start looking at other things? So even to secure ourselves, I think we are still struggling to have the right amount of technology come in. So when you start collecting data from all these devices, that's the amount of storage you need. Right? Leaving on the side the business intelligence. And if you combine all these things, there's so much of money you require. But some point in time, that's going to determine the survival of the organization. So I'm actually answering his question in a roundabout way.
So does the bandwidth and all, I mean, Sri Lanka having only one gateway, would that be kind of like a bottleneck in us being able to use the benefits, let's say we're bad about the benefits of big data?
See, if you look at bandwidth, it is never a limitation. There's Lankacom which can provide you outside the SLT. So getting bandwidth is not an issue. At what price? So I think at the end of the day, cost-benefit analysis. So what would you want to invest and what is the return you're going to get? Whether it makes business sense. So if you talk to any company, not only Sri Lanka, anywhere in the world, that's the way they would look at it. And the other thing is regulations. So if the government or the industry starts regulating, then there is mandatory controls which comes in. The regulatory controls are also very expensive to maintain. Okay?
Question is whether the organizations are making use of this. I think we are at a very, at the beginning of it, so I don't think any organization has gone to that level to use it in a big way to do business. I don't know whether anyone is doing it in a small way, but I don't think anyone has gone to that extent. Property, no?
So let's look at basics. Some of the things which David spoke about, some of the things which spoke about. In terms of employees' activity on Facebook, employees' activity on the internet, employees' activity within the organization. If you start looking at all these things, there is something called good governance and good behavior. Is he really being effective on the job? So if you start measuring him in terms of his effectiveness, that amount of data is required, but you don't even collect that information. Especially if you look at the marketing guy, if you ask him, have you met the customers, he'll say yes. So we really don't track him to see whether he was really there at the customer location. We don't track him through GPS and all that. So when you start doing that, there's an initial cost plus then a recurring cost. So I think what the organizations need to do is they should need to be aware of the complete gamut of things, the framework, and then say this is what we will do probably this year, and have a long-term strategy. So they can't just jump in overnight just because they came to this session and start off. But I think the importance of this session is to create awareness. Right? So there's something like this happening, and these are the benefits of doing these things.
But can an organization, like say, I'm just saying, okay, let's say an organization wants to, if it's a consultancy-based organization, they want to monitor where the consultants are. So they use big data. They use Android phones to find the location, and they find exactly are they in the consulting client's place. Are these legal?
I'll take a part of it now. This again goes back to what Sudhir mentioned of the national security supersedes. So generally, if you look at many of our organizations' policies, we say that whatever the communications, your browsing patterns, everything is being monitored. Right? Probably it's like you walk into a shop and they say CCTV cameras in operation. So in our case, actually, with our insurance entity, we actually to see where the assessors are, we use that. So whenever an accident is reported, to find out the nearest assessor, we use GPS tracking. So
Why is the cabs use GPS as well?
Yes.
So it again, if you have a policy, Mansuri, if there is a policy defined that this is how you will be governed, so then it is legal. Right? Now I know in Sri Lanka there's one company, which is a very small consulting firm. They have given mobile phones to their staff, and there's a spy software running on it. Every single call, every single word which is spoken is recorded. And this guy actually sits in the evening and goes through every call. And the employee is told that you're being monitored. So it also says where exactly he is at any given point in time. So we have arrived at a place where we're going to be monitored implicitly. Like it or not, it's going to happen.
Okay, what advice would you give to a person to say reduce his exposure? You can't eliminate it. So what practical steps you would give a normal person? No? Now it's all this, there's a lot of data that is out there in the net now. Most people spend their time. What are the, just by deleting cookies, for example, can that reduce my exposure?
I think we'll ask the Singapore experience.
Yeah, I think the common mistake that people are doing on the internet is just purely because unaware of the repercussions of their actions, right? And people are unaware if they put in their date of birth, for example, right, or their mother's name. In fact, all of this information are used for bank verifications, all right, and it might go to the wrong hand. I think awareness is very important, right?
So more thing like awareness. So would it be possible even like for organizations to have a social media policy? Would that help also? Produce for them to ensure that they don't share information that can be used by hackers? Would that be a viable thing also?
Yeah, from Oracle perspective, we have that policy, in fact, because there is one situation where, we encourage our expert to write a blog within Oracle website, and it just happened that at that time, people are using their own personal Facebook account. Right. So when the guy left the organization, then they start writing something which is against Oracle. Right. So this kind of thing actually may happen. Right. So the policy is very important, because through that policy, then the organization will be able to take action if such thing happen.
Just to add to what he is saying, I think if you really seriously look at all your appointment letters, if you're not saying it yesterday, when you go back, if you look at it, there's one clause definitely all appointment letters will have, is that you don't bring disrepute to the organization while in employment, after employment. So it's an indefinite period, so the company can always come back and sue you for it. Second, you are also governed by a confidentiality clause in your appointment letter itself. So the social media policy, if you ask me, it's already there. It's nothing new. But what we're trying to do right now is categorically list down the things to do and not to do. We can have a policy in our intranet, but that will only be effective the more you talk about it, the more you discuss. Enforcement. Otherwise, they're not going to know about it. So they might accidentally, disclose some information, or accidentally comment something, or they might out of context say something, but for somebody who's reading it, it might mean something else. So it's more in terms of being cautious about, like we always say, silence is golden. So I think if everybody practices that, I think all these problems will be solved. Do you want to say something?
Probably I'd go with say policies generally you put for few reasons, but just having a policy may not really help, unless awareness is there. But having a policy is always good, so you clearly, if your employees have any doubts, then you can basically clarify those. For example, now last time we had a similar discussion, and still we had a sort of a debate. Who should really drive the social media strategy? Is it the CIO? Is it the chief marketing officer? Or is it someone else? So those are your social media strategy should be there, right? Say maybe certain business sectors, like if you are from a sort of conglomerate, maybe certain things you may not really want to go into social media, but certain sectors, say for example something like leisure, so you may really want to go there. So all that things, who's going to be responsible? Now there are, if you really practically try to do it, there are many questions. Now how do you give KPIs for those people who are actually monitoring or doing social media thing? Is it, how fast you respond, or if it's a leisure site, is it the amount of revenue generated? So, and when you run something, say someone posting from UK or US, they'll expect the answer maybe in minutes, but here it may be after 5. So all these things, I think the first thing should be your social media strategy should be formulated if you're really serious about it. And then the responsibility, accountability and all those things need to be defined, and at the end of the day, all your users, who are the people who are really using it, they should be aware now. See, for example, certain things in the IT policies, we can easily say these are the things you can do, you can't do. But in your office, you can't really do that. People will be bringing their own devices, right? Your mobile phones, they can access Facebook, tablets. So if you, really simply think blocking Facebook will, or social media will give you the answer, no. So we have actually crossed that stage. So all things need to be seriously discussed and should have a clear strategy.
For the audience, anybody has any questions, please?
Now, given our current behavioral patterns and the devices we use, we have a lot of digital footprint. Okay. Given the current behavioral patterns, because a lot of people are online now, and the devices we use, we leave behind a lot of digital like signatures and footprint, and some are like we choose to leave behind, others are like we have no choice in it. So given this context, like where would the concept of privacy go, or will it holds true? Because like of course if the government accesses, I have no issue provided it for national security, but it's not only the government who access this data, right? Commercial establishments access this where they have no right. Right? So where does the concept of privacy go in this case?
I'll give you three scenarios. The scenario is this: like when you buy a mobile phone, normally you go to the counter, you buy the mobile phone, and if you have a SIM card, you're ready to go. But when you buy a SIM card, there's so much of information you disclose on that, isn't it? And the day the mobile phone becomes a mobile bank, then you will be required to do KYC. The central bank is already putting down the guidelines for it. So your SIM card will get activated in probably, how long does it take to get an active SIM card here?
2 hours.
2 hours? 2 hours. India, it takes 4 days. That's because they want to really do a background check on the person. You go to Philippines, if you show the dollar, you have the SIM card active. So here's one identity traveling into different geographies, and they're governed by different rules or policies. So when you look at from that perspective, each of these countries have their own set of laws. It's not the same thing, especially on the cyber aspect. So we've still not arrived a consensus on that. So if you ask me, privacy, good thing to talk about, but enforcement will be a challenge. I mean, certain places you go to, that person has so much of information about you. Like, you walk into a restaurant, the feeds are there, your footprints are there on the CCTV. So who's watching it? That kind of thing.
Anybody to say?
Now, most of the companies, they allow to use the personal device to connect corporate network. In that scenario, how do you see the security? How do you address the security of the corporate network?
Good question. I think this is a very good question which every company is asking about. We as a bring your own device policy, where people can bring their own device and do it. Now, as a security consultant, the first thing I say is, okay, you bring your own device. First thing I want to write is GYOD, that is, give me your device. So you bring it, but I want your device. So when you bring your device, I set the policy for you to operate. So there is a policy which says this is the baseline on which you will use that device on my network. So you comply to my corporate policy. So if it requires to run an antivirus, you have to run it. If you have to do certain things, it has to fall in line with it. Otherwise, you don't connect. And you also get them to sign off. The same security levels have to be ensured when using your own device. Now, this has only come up now because you're asking them to bring a mobile device. But there are people who are still using their own desktop from home, which doesn't even licensed software or antivirus. So they use the same machine, which is infected, to connect to the corporate network on a secure connectivity. So one is the policy, the other one is the enforcement. The third one would be to continuously monitor to see this thing. And I would encourage all of you to look at COVID, because COVID has all these things very nicely laid out. Now, for example, you're talking about the social strategy. So if the organization's objective, business objective is customer service, that's the business objective. So when you look at, you translate that into an IT objective, then you would say where the technology is going to be used. And in that context, it will also define what are the measures which you need to have to monitor the effectiveness of the IT. So you're also looking at the balanced scorecard from an IT perspective, not necessarily from the business. So it is all completely, easily, nicely tied into one.
Now, Vandhavan, you sometime back you said that the traffics are monitoring. Traffic is monitoring.
Yes.
In that scenario, how do you see that now we use different algorithm for the encrypted data and also VPN data also? Those are subject to the monitoring those data.
Correct. See, when you use an encryption algorithm, as individuals we may not be able to crack it because key is managed on the device itself. So key management becomes essential. But if the national security team like NSA or maybe CID, if they decide if they are mandated, I think Sri Lanka is going to be mandated as an enforcement organization, they will have access to the keys.
Even payment gateway?
Absolutely, everything. Even the ATMs are monitored.
I believe that when you encrypt something, it will be specially tagged. I think because it's not normal, and when you encrypt, I think it gets special attention by the agents who is watching it. So
if you look at what happened in Snowden's case, and everybody said the traffic is going to be monitored. So there was so much of noise in the internet community saying, okay, start using Tor. Tor, the investment arm, it is a company funded by CIA. So you have a problem and then you direct all the other people also into another hole. So eventually, if you look at the top 25 companies, the tech companies which are actually booming right now, they are all funded by CIA. There's an article in the internet, so you can actually go and look at it.
I think you have to say about
It's maybe
Toe is actually acronym is the onion ring mistaken. So you use it to
anonymously browse.
Yes, we can put it in those terms without breaking the law, I think.
Exactly.
So
you do good things and bad things anonymously. So you think nobody knows who you are.
I would
In
say
essence,
reasonably anonymously.
Anybody else? Questions?
I think we have answered all Mantri's questions. Any?
Oh, there's more questions.
but there were some other questions which you put.
Yes, I got some questions. Okay, when we come to data leak prevention, there are some softwares there. How do they tie up with big data? Oracle?
We like
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you mentioned about this data loss protection. I myself have a experience on deploying DLP double solutions over one of the major banks. It's a global rollout covering 15 countries, right? So if you take a look at DLP, basically there are a few areas where organization will be focusing. First area, they will take a look at the gateway, right? From the network perspective, they'll make sure that if there are confidential information you send out, that the organization is aware whether it is according to the policy. If somebody from inside the bank is sending out like 50,000 credit card records outside, for example, you would like to know about it. Another area, people also look at it from the endpoints perspective, right? They put in agents inside the laptop, making sure that the user are not storing those critical information in plain text inside their laptop. right? And last area that usually organizations have big difficulties is at the storage level. Because if you take a look at the nature of the DLP solution is that in order to perform a analysis, it needs to do a scanning of all of those informations. And you can imagine the bank that I served before, they have 26 terabyte of data. Right, to analyze 26 terabyte of data, it is as if copying 26 terabyte of files into a DLP solution. So DLP solution will die, right? Yeah. So there are different type of approach when we talk about protection of data, but from my perspective is that we should focus on the preventions, right, and just detection of it, right? Analysis of data, yes, that's good, this gives you visibility, but by the end of the day, if you do not enforce it, then there is a problem. Right, so that would be, it's a bit of marketing. That's the functionality from the Oracle technology is basically focusing at the back end of the data, right, at the storage level, make sure that there is a preventive control being implemented there. But again, if we talk about DLP, the biggest challenge in DLP is in fact the policy itself. So I was talking to the risk management unit in one of these major international bank, and they were talking about, well, you know, sending critical information from one person to another person internally is a part of our business as usual, right? And what would be considered as the threshold? If somebody is sending 5,000 critical information for the purpose of business, would that actually against the organization policy? How about 7,000? How about 10,000? How about 50,000? So how do you define the number? All right, so this type of policy is something which is difficult to craft, right? And that has a lot of things to do with the classification of data. And classification the data based on secret, confidential, public is already a big major nightmare. If you need to classify the data up to that level, it's going to be an even bigger issue. All right, so I guess from a DLP perspective, there's no such thing as foolproof. Right, but if you want to really embark on it, make sure that you have a very clear policy of what you want to do, right? Especially from data classifications, because if not, the tool is just becoming a white elephant, right? There is no such real policy that you're enforcing as part of what the tool is supposed to do.
So I think you answered my other question also. So
can I just add something to classification? I think that is the essence of your question. That is where the challenge is. Who classifies the data? You put a tool will sit there. But somebody has to tell the tool in the form of rules what has to be classified. And most of the time, the DLP implementations fail because the data classification becomes a challenge. So if you look at an organization, there are different business units. The IT department cannot classify the data because they don't run the business. So the individual businesses will have to identify which data is confidential, which is not. So you can't classify everything as confidential. Now, for example, recently I was talking to somebody, he said, all my emails are confidential. So even if I invite you for lunch, is it confidential? So sometimes you end up spending a lot of money protecting an asset which is not expensive or confidential. So right now there are tools in the market, there are products in the market which actually integrates very well with Oracle. Like Titus is a product where you can install. So every time, let's say you open an Excel sheet, it will force you to define the classification levels as confidential or non-confidential. So the challenge for us is to identify all what has been done before and classify them. So every time you open a document which is already created, it will force you to classify it. So you can take that approach. The second thing is the digital rights management. So you need to classify the data. You also need to have the digital rights management, saying who will have access to the document which you create and for how long that person will have. So again, that rests with the business unit. And these two solutions go hand in hand when you actually plan to have your data in the cloud. The third aspect is that you need to look at encryption. So it's not just having one solution saying, okay, we will have DLP, but all these things have to work in unison. It's like a choir singing the song. right? So the CEO orchestrates everyone in the organization sing along in the right tune. Otherwise, the DLP will fail. There will be data solutions.
Yeah, okay now with that. Any questions from the audience? Any questions from the audience on what you have heard up to now?
Are we getting any prizes for these guys? Any raffle draws, any new prizes you're going to give? It's all after lunch, right?
After lunch.
Only for those who will stay.
Stay.
Yeah, till the end, right? So there's some interesting prizes
There are some
at the end of this.
Yes, there are some interesting prizes at the end of this session.
So please stay.
But as a thank you, we'd like to give Mr. Ashokan to give this token of appreciation to our speaker.